Girls, welcome back to the Bokeh Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Holritz. It's good to have you back today. We're back to kind of I think what will be a regular schedule actually for a while now, which is 1 to 2, maybe 2 live streams a week. We're usually going to publish 1 Bokeh Podcast episode a week on the audio side. And of course, if you're a Spotify subscriber or user, you get both the audio and the video. And I should mention that more often, actually. We're one of the few, if maybe the only photography podcast on Spotify with video right now. So take advantage of that. These live streams go to video, and you can have kind of best of both worlds. The way the Spotify works, at least on my phone, is you can be watching the video, and then if you need to focus on whatever is at hand, you can X out of that and still listen to the audio. It's kind of a cool deal. So take advantage of that. Just a little side note. But we will continue to push 1 to 2 episodes out a week on the live stream, and then 1 episode a week on audio. And for those of you that are live streaming with us today, thank you. I'm excited to have you here, and please don't be shy. Join in the conversation, ask questions, comment, send us funny emojis. We're getting into actually a really compelling conversation. And of course, I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a second, but I'm really excited about this today and super practical for everybody. We'll get to that in a second. For those of you that are listening to the audio version of this after the fact, come join us in the live streams. Follow us at Bokeh Podcast, Bokeh Podcast on Instagram, and you can keep up to date with the upcoming live stream schedule. And then one other quick note before I introduce our guest for today, as I normally would, just want to encourage you all to look for opportunities to give back. I normally pop up a receipt on the screen today, but I made my donation to Charity Water before the episode. And I would just encourage everybody to look for those opportunities. One of our guests, Sean Lee, actually was on the show a number of years, not even years ago, probably maybe a year and a half ago, and really pushed me in this regard. I think we should look for opportunities, much like Sean does, to look for opportunities in our community, national organizations, international organizations, to give back. So let's look for those opportunities and give back as we can. All right, enough of the intro. Let's bring in our brand new guest for today. Heather Chesky is here with me. Heather, thank you so much for coming to hang out with me, have this conversation, a compelling conversation at that.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, and we don't really know each other a whole lot, so this is kind of a cool opportunity in that I get to know you along with our audience, and I appreciate you being willing to come just kind of take a chance, jump in, have a conversation. And we're going to actually be talking about how to book clients in the span of a 30-minute phone call. And again, I'm super genuinely interested. I don't actively photograph anymore, but this is really compelling. And I think there's a lot here for me to learn as well as our listeners. So we'll get to that in just a second. But as a way to kind of introduce you, your brand, let's talk a little bit about brand position. What are you doing professionally right now? And what is your business's brand position?
Great question. I would say the biggest thing that I've done, not initially in my business, because initially I got this all out of whack, but just really having my priorities in order. I believe to the core that in order to be successful in business and in life and in relationships, we need to have our faith first, then our family second, and then business as a third. And so I think just getting those priorities in line really helps just to really maximize all of our relationships in business and also in personal life.
Okay, cool. So that kind of sets a baseline for you as far as how you approach life and business. Yes. What sets, now I know that we were chatting for a few minutes before we got started today. You are primarily focused on education for the sake of photographers. You're still photographing a little bit. You said continuing to work with existing clients, yes. I guess that you've developed over the last 10 years. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, but then your main focus is education for the photography community. Tell us what that business's brand position is. What sets that apart from some of the other education that's out there?
That's a great question. So a lot of my story, a quick Cliff Note version is, 10 years ago, I was working a steady day job. I had a baby at home, and I lost my job completely unexpectedly on a Wednesday afternoon, a Wednesday morning, and I had to replace my income. There was no wiggle room in our finances at the time. And so basically photography was a hobby. I was like, okay, I got to make this work, and I want to make it work in such a way where I could be present in the life of my child and then children. And so a lot of my position in my business and also in the education that I do is really building a profitable business that allows you to be a husband or a wife who's present and then also present in the life of your children. So obviously blessing your kids and, you know, your clients and providing a great service, but then also not doing it for free and really making sure your family gets a return. I believe, like, you know, every time I leave the house, I need to be bringing something back home for my family to pour into them. So I feel like for me, I'm very adamant, and I teach this a lot with my students, is just growing a profitable business that allows you to have that time and financial freedom to where you don't have to photograph, you know, 40 sessions a month at $100 a pop just to make ends meet.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, and I can actually jump to your website here real quick. And so for anybody listening in, make sure you go to Heather. Actually, I think that the official URL is The Booked Photographer. You can also go to heatherchesky.com. Chesky is spelled CHESKY.com. But there on your site, it says, "Hi, I'm Heather, and I help photographers get booked." And I mean, that in and of itself is a pretty simple and clear brand position statement. That is your focus. And you added kind of an addendum to that in the conversation just now, which is you help photographers get booked for the sake of creating freedom in their lives, for the sake of the important relationships in their lives. And I think that's, of course, a super important part of that.
Absolutely.
But I appreciate you kind of explaining that. And let's actually just jump from that question then to a question about customer experience. We're going to come back to time management, especially as it relates to family, in a second. But from your experience, both as a photographer and then working with photographers as well, what would you say is the biggest principle or idea driving the customer experience that you provide for your customers?
Yes, great question as well. For me personally, I have made it a goal for so many years now. It's like, I want to be the person who answers the questions before they're even asked. So back when I was photographing a whole lot of weddings and seniors and families, it was just like, I want to make sure I provide all the information they need in a timely manner, and also remind them, because people forget, so that they just don't ever have a question in the process. They know what to expect when they are prepared, they are ready, which also leads into, you know, having the calls that we're going to be talking about in a moment, but just basically providing that information for them so they can make the best possible decision and also be confident in their decision.
So proactive communication and expectations management, it seems like kind of how to best sum that up. And that's super important. It's been a point of conversation here on the podcast a lot, and I'm glad for that. You know, it's funny, sometimes things can seem, or concepts, ideas can seem a bit repetitive. Are you familiar with Gary Vaynerchuk, for example?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so if you follow his content for any period of time, even for like a week, you're going to hear him say a lot of the same things over and over again. And I think some people get kind of annoyed at that. And what I've actually realized the value in that over the years, especially as a business owner and a marketer myself, that sometimes in life, in fact, actually a lot of times in life, there's that 80-20 principle at play, right? It's the 20% of the ideas that do 80% of the heavy lifting. And so the idea of repeating some principles or concepts is actually, I think, a really great thing, because it's easy to be like, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea, and then go about our lives or our businesses and not actually apply it. Sometimes it bears repeating a few times, and then the light bulbs come on. We're like, oh yeah, I guess I should go do that thing.
Right, exactly. It is so true.
Well, let's jump on then on that note to, and we're going to actually kind of come back to that conversation about family and business, time management, right? I have two kids myself, and I mean, as far as having the opportunity, the freedom, the flexibility to connect with them, that was really, and has been, one of the driving factors as an entrepreneur for me. I want to have the freedom, the flexibility, that if I want to drop my work and go do something with them in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, and have that time to ultimately dedicate to the relationship with them. So when it comes to running a business and finding some version of your balance between work and family life, what does that look like for you? And I guess more specifically, again, what is the big idea that drives that ability?
Yes, this is a great question again as well. And I want to share just teeny tiny story of when I really learned this lesson and really found out, okay, how do I have balance? How do I actually maximize on the time that I'm giving? Many, many years ago, my husband was actually had some chronic health issues. And so he was on disability for quite a few years. And that meant that he literally couldn't even get out of bed, couldn't even drive. And at that point in time, we had 2 children. And that was just such a difficult season where I had no balance whatsoever because I was doing the job of 2 parents and also taking care of an ailing husband. And then I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old and also a business that was financially responsible for everything. And it was just insane. I spent many days crying, but it was in that season that I began to ask myself this question that I've just always come back to. And the question is, what is the one thing that I can do right now that will have the biggest impact in my business? And oftentimes in that season, and life can be crazy even now. So even now, I would only have like 15 minutes or 20 minutes to work in my business. And so I would ask myself that, hey, what's the one thing I can do right now that'll have the biggest return in my business? And that answer would change depending on the season and depending what was happening. And so I would focus in on that one thing, really prioritize the most important task and let go of the rest because I'm not Superwoman. I can't do everything. And so that question really just helped me prioritize everything in my life.
I love that. Back to that 80-20 principle again, right? The 20% doing 80% of the work. And it's so true on so many levels. And we could literally spend 2-3 hours talking just about this. I'm sure between the two of us. I guess one important question that comes to mind, though, as you're describing this approach to work and balance in life, how do you decide what the most important thing is? Because, if we look at our days as business owners and as individuals, part of a family or any type of relationship, there's just a lot on the list, right? So then it's a question of what actually does the heaviest lifting, makes the biggest difference, has the biggest impact, the biggest leverage. And I'm curious how you make that decision.
Yes, I am personally a fan of doing fewer things really, really well versus a whole lot of things half-assed. So I've always looked at, okay, like what do I currently have in front of me? Who are the clients that I currently have or the current inquiries? How can I maximize that relationship? And so I've just wanted to always be faithful with what's already been given to me rather than go chase after something that I don't have yet, trying all the, marketing hacks or tweaks or trends, and really just kind of spinning my wheels versus just, okay, I have XYZ, let me focus on building those to the best of my ability. And then as time allows, as my energy level, I can bring on something else.
That's good. Yeah, that's actually, it is so tempting with all the options out there for us to go to the next thing. Sometimes we do it, whether consciously or subconsciously, as a distraction from what actually needs to be done or is the most
shiny
important
object
thing.
syndrome is a real thing.
100%. And by the way, I'm guilty of it too, so I understand.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. A lot of times it is focusing on what we got here right now and doing that well and doing it consistently that can make the biggest difference. And the payoff comes from that. So that's a great reminder. Okay. So time management, one of the ideas, principles that helps most effectively with time management is the idea of delegation. With photographers, I would say still, speaking of that 80-20, outsourcing editing can be certainly one of those things. I'm not biased at all, I promise. But in addition to that, there's, delegating, say, administrative tasks like email management and bookings, delegating accounting work, album design. I mean, there's quite a bit of a list that we can come up with. Is this a concept, a principle you've experimented with in your businesses?
100%. Earlier this year, I actually hired on my first full-time employee. So that's been something, and I've had like other contract workers throughout the year. So that's always been a part of the process, but I made that big jump in hiring out somebody full-time just, 6 months ago. And that's just been so valuable because it really allows me to focus on the things that I really enjoy doing in my business, the things that I'm best suited to do, and things that just light me up. And then my employee can handle all the other odds and ends, the things that need to get done, but I don't necessarily care about doing, but I can't ignore them completely.
Yeah, and the other maybe something that you've kind of experimented with is not just the things that you like or dislike, using that as a point of reference to make a decision about what to delegate, but then also the things that don't require you to be involved too, right?
Absolutely. That's huge. Yeah. And I think it's just learning how to replace yourself in little areas that don't necessarily take your unique stand or your unique input, and replace it with somebody who can do the job just as well and perhaps even quicker.
Well, and what's funny about that, I mean, it's amusing, but I think there's some practicality to it too. Like 2022, at least American culture anyway, like we're treating ourselves all like unique butterflies. And certainly there are elements of us that are unique, but I think we also like put so much significance and weight on how important and unique we are that we then lose sight of the opportunity to be able to delegate something, which by the way, most of what we could do, what we do can be handled by somebody else. And I think learning to kind of give up the little bit of the ego involved in that conversation
and
means
control.
that we have, and the control associated with that,
Yes.
absolutely gives us the opportunity then to be able to grow and scale our business and to do exactly what you've been doing. A little side note question about this, actually, I'm curious. So you hired your first full-time employee, you've worked with contractors previously. Communication, to me, at least from my experience anyway, is the biggest, I guess, complicating factor in the process of learning to delegate, right? Because, I mean, something like editing or email management, both of those things, we're talking about our voice, right? A reflection of our brand. And certainly there are other elements of our business that are similar. So we're trying to communicate something that we want to somebody else that doesn't necessarily even communicate the same way that we do. So words don't even necessarily mean the same thing, right? But we want them to do this thing in a way that mirrors us, that mirrors our brand. And that's a challenge because what I've found, I've been guilty of it, and I've seen from other photographers at Photographers Edit, is photographers a lot of times will say, do this thing, but they don't give the instructions or the detailed instructions along with it. They just kind of assume subconsciously that we're going to figure out what they think. And that just creates a nightmare of a scenario, right? So how have you learned to more effectively communicate for the sake of good delegation?
Yes. So what I do with my person is every Monday, we actually have a video Zoom meet. So we're in constant communication. We go over the big tasks for that week, what he's responsible for, my expectations for him. And then also on top of that, every single day, like we actually use Asana, which is a great management system just to, delegate things and have, the to-do items. And so every morning before his shift starts, I send him a list of what I expect for him to get done. At the end of the day, he sends me a list back saying what he got done, any, issues he ran into, those kind of things. But it's so funny that you mentioned this because I've been working with him now for 6 months and he's wonderful. But in the initial months, I had to learn how to communicate where I would just send him a task to do. He would do it. And I'm like, well, this is not what I wanted. Like, this is crap. Like I could have done it in like half the time. Now we're going to have to go back through and do everything all over again. And so it was really frustrating for me. But then I had to take a look. I'm like, okay, you know what? I never actually explained the process for him. And actually, honestly, English is his second language too. So that is another barrier to having the communication. So I've learned like anything new that I do, I'm going to record a video tutorial first, walking him through the whole process. And that's something that he can rewatch, or if like it's a task that, maybe only needs to get done every couple of weeks, he could go back and rewatch it if he needs to like just, refresh his memory. So those are the things that have helped us.
That's interesting. It's funny. You talk about working with somebody who has English as a second language. I grew up overseas. In business as an entrepreneur, I've worked with those overseas quite a bit, actually. So when you add that additional factor into the process of delegation, man, it further complicates it. But it also, I think, sets us up as entrepreneurs to do what I think is super helpful when it comes to learning how to communicate more effectively, which is to communicate like you're speaking to a fifth grader or a sixth grader. And it's not about intelligence. It's just about language, something that can potentially get lost in translation. I mean, this happens with English speaking people, those who speak English as their primary language, but then it will certainly happen with those that don't. And so learning how to communicate something in such a simple way that even a fifth or sixth grader can understand it, then of course translates to somebody who is not speaking English as a primary language. And it further kind of emphasizes the skill set that we need to develop, which is to learn to communicate simply. So that's an interesting challenge that you've learned to, I guess, process and deal with.
Yeah. And I mean, I actually used to live overseas myself. So I was the one who was just like, nobody gets me. I don't understand anything. And I felt like alone. Like, I mean, there was one instance where I was in an overseas place and I was just like, there's no other English speakers around here. This is crazy. And I was that way for a solid few weeks. And it was just really hard for me. But then also too, I just understand the importance of being able to communicate. And then also too, it's like right now we're in the process of building out an entire library of video tutorials. So whenever we add onto our team, or if for some reason he moves on to another thing, we already have that system built, which I think is really helpful too.
Okay, that's good. And yeah, you're right. I mean, I have endless videos backed up in Dropbox as point of reference, and I can send those videos to various members of our team. It is nice to have that to go back to. I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to record keeping, because I always want to be able to point back to a conversation, whether it's a text message, Slack message, video meeting, whatever it is. And I think it's actually a smart way to go, especially when you start working with more and more people, to be able to go back to reference something. So yeah, a little extra tip for everybody listening in. Let's keep going though. And actually, by the way, for anybody listening in who I know I kind of alluded to Photographers Edit in passing, but photographersedit.com, if you're not outsourcing editing yet, go check it out. You can use the code Bokeh Podcast for 40% off your first order. Just throw that little extra bonus out there for those of you that are not using Photographers Edit yet. But last question before we get into the topic at hand. Favorite book, self-help book, business book that you would want to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, so this might catch you by surprise, but it's honestly the Bible. I believe like the Bible is like the greatest book on success ever written. And there are so many principles in there that I have just applied in my life and in my business that I have seen just work. Specifically, the book of Proverbs is really amazing. We were talking earlier about being faithful with what's already in front of you. That's straight from the Bible. I could list off other principles, and there's also really other, non-biblical great books as well. But I think a lot of them like stem from principles that are found in the Bible. So that's one thing that I really enjoy, that I always go back to. Yeah,
and Proverbs is rich with principles. I mean, that's largely what that book centers around, it seems.
Yep.
So that's really interesting. I don't even have to pull that one up on Amazon. I think anybody can find a Bible.
Exactly. If you do want to pull one up on Amazon, I'm also a fan of Profit First by Mike Michalkowicz, I think is how you pronounce it. That's a book that I've actually read a couple of times. Every couple of months, I reread it just to make sure my business is profitable, because if you're not profitable, if you're not making money, you really don't have much of a business. You just have an expensive hobby. So that's also something that I've been a book that has made a big impact to my business as well.
That's good. Yeah, an expensive hobby. That's something to keep in mind too. And I did pull that up. I'll pull it back up on Amazon. Profit First: Transform Your Business from a Cash-Eating Monster to a Money-Making Machine. And we'll link to that in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com as well. All right, so the primary topic at hand, Heather, we're going to talk about how we can develop a 30-minute phone call that will consistently convert a potential client to a paying client. And let's just start with kind of an introduction, if you will. Like, well, first of all, have you always been a natural salesperson? I know it doesn't come naturally for me, per se.
No, not at all.
What's the backstory there?
And honestly, even to this day, I still get nervous and anxious. But back when I first started, I would just get knots in my stomach. My face would turn all beet red. I would stutter over my words. Like, this was definitely not something that I was born with the ability to do. And I think that's the thing too, where like we can learn anything, especially in business, is just a skill set that if we just practice it, we become better at it.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so I'm curious, and maybe you're going to touch on this. When I think about difficulty in sales, I think one of the biggest difficulties that I've faced trying to be a salesperson is when I'm selling something that doesn't come naturally to speak about. That was not a very well phrased sentence, but I think you get where I'm going with that. So, for example, Photographers Edit. I started Photographers Edit because of the concept that we were talking about earlier, time. I wanted more freedom, more flexibility in my life, especially for the sake of relationships. And so Photographers Edit was born. And the cool thing is that also benefits other photographers in the same way. It gives them more freedom, more flexibility in their lives for the sake of relationships and doing things that actually grow their business. So it's natural for me to talk about it because it comes from a very personal and deep place. I don't have to try to sell it. I can speak from personal experience. so it flows more naturally. It's those instances where I'm trying to sell something that I either don't know very well and or doesn't come from personal experience that seems to kind of complicate things a little bit. Has that been your experience as well?
So, and we'll get into this as well. I think one of the things, if it's hard for you to sell it, then maybe you don't necessarily believe in it, or you're talking to somebody who you're trying to push it on and you haven't yet taken the time to really learn about them or their needs first. And you're trying to be more of that sleazy salesman, which what we're going to go into today is not about that. So we're going to jump past that process.
Okay, cool. So we'll get to that. And that's actually a really interesting distinction. But the 2 points that you made, knowing what it is that you're selling, and then two, also knowing the person that you're selling to so that you can kind of sell in context, if you will, of who that person is. That's really cool. So where did you end up learning these sales techniques? Did you end up reading a bunch of books, listening to speakers? Like how did you go about that?
Yes. So it was a lot of trial and error initially. And then also I also really like to hire my own photographers for like my son's newborn photos when they were born, and then also family photography throughout the year. So I think it's super important to put ourselves in the client's shoes, not just simply trade with another photographer, but actually be paying clients, because we can learn so much about the process of being that paying client. And so I've done that quite a bit, and I've had some really great experiences, and then some experiences that were like, ooh, man, like I need to change this in my experience because I did not like being on the receiving end of that. So that was also a portion of it. And then also one of my very first business coaches also really helped me finesse this strategy as well.
Okay, cool. So before we get to practical application, what this actually looks like, what this phone call looks like, how it breaks down, there's a kind of a pain point for our industry. And I was talking to you about this a little bit before we got started. It's come up quite a bit on the podcast as well. And that is introversion. And it plays into the apprehensions that I think a lot of photographers have, even when it comes to just the general idea of sales. The idea of talking to somebody that we don't know, that we're not familiar with, going into groups of people or otherwise. There's just a certain level of apprehension that a lot of photographers have because they're self-professed introverted individuals. So to that end, I'm curious if you would be willing to share a few pointers, if you will, that will enable photographers to kind of move beyond those introverted tendencies to be able to handle this call more effectively.
Sure. So just overall, I think the things that make you the uncomfortable the most are likely the things that you need to be doing the most often in your business. Yeah. So if getting on the phone and talking to a potential client is really outside of your comfort zone, use that as a GPS of like, okay, that's my next area of growth. That's when I can experience this next up level in my business. So I think the uncomfortableness is a good indicator of the thing that you need to be working on. But aside from that, there are three ways that I think we can approach the conversation on the phone with more, just better prepared for it. And the first one is actually just the preparation and leading up to it. So I actually use a system called Calendly. It's just where an appointment calendar where people can just schedule a time to they can talk to me. It's not the only system out there, but I really like using that because within that system, I mean, I can actually dedicate, the certain days and times that I want to talk to a client. So they're not going to schedule a call at like 8:00 at night because that's not going to be available for them. But then also on that scheduling page, I can also get more information about them. So I'm not going into the call blindly. And then also with using a service like Calendly, you can auto schedule emails. And so like reminder emails, prep emails. And so that also lays the foundation so that they're prepared for the call and like they're coming into it with a little bit more knowledge as well. So that would be the first point, is just actually being prepared and having all the ducks in a row. Yep. The second thing I would say is just practicing. We mentioned earlier that like anything, you can learn anything. It's just all a skill set, but you learn it by actually practicing. So I would have these conversations. I would practice them by myself. I would practice asking the questions. I would practice with a friend or with a spouse. So like I would actually have these conversations, not just like mentally going through my head, but actually get used to the words coming out of my mouth so that when I was on the phone with a client, it just flowed that much more easily. And then third thing.
Before you get to the third thing, I have to ask, I'm a total nerd, and this is what I do. I'll practice before a presentation or a conversation that I need to have with a client, a friend, a family member. I will actually do it out. Like I'm driving in the car and I'm having this conversation out loud just to practice I think about the words, how I approach it. I have a tendency of talking too much, so trying to refine it down as well. Do you do that kind of thing?
I do. I absolutely do. It's so funny. When I started photographing high school seniors way back in the day, and I was really learning like the posing and the process for that, I would literally stand in my in front of my bathroom mirror, and I would practice the poses myself with me like looking at my reflection. And like that just got me comfortable with directing my clients. So I think there's just so much benefit in the practice portion.
Okay, cool. So we got prepare, practice, and what's the third step?
Yeah, the third step is actually having a chat map, which are the steps that we're going to go into on today's call, but literally actually having something written out that you can refer to when you're actually on a call with somebody. And like that just prevents you from being like, oh, like my mind went blank. Like, what do I say here? But actually having, okay, like step 1 or question 1, question 2, question 3, you can, and not that you actually have to hold to it like tooth and nail, but at least it gives you a flow of where to go, what the end goal of the conversation actually is.
Yeah, that's, in fact, you and I talked about this before we started the podcast today. And I've mentioned this before, but for everybody listening in, to kind of break the fourth wall, I'll send an outline of talking points and questions to my guests before they come on the show. And what I explained to Heather was it's not meant to force that conversation to be robotic. It's just to give direction and flow ultimately to the conversation. And of course, that makes it a lot easier for the end listener as well, right? So that's a really great point. And going into even something like a phone call, having a plan, a direction to go really can make that conversation easier, or better, I would say, more effective, but also easier for the photographer who's apprehensive because they're like, oh, I don't know this person. I don't know what's going to happen. You can actually plan for it in that way. That's good. Okay, cool. So let's just jump into the meat of it. Let's talk about the primary steps. I think you mentioned there were 5 primary steps or ideas that drive this 30-minute call. Take it away.
Cool. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and say the 5 steps first, and then like we can, park ourselves at each step if you'd like to.
That's great.
The first step is to basically introduce yourself and establish the boundaries. You want to take the lead in this conversation, not let your potential client just ramble on for 30 minutes. The second step is to actually ask insightful questions to learn more about them, what they're looking for, their experience, their end goal with the photos. The third step is to actually reaffirm, like basically repeat back what you heard your potential client say, and then also like tie that in with the photography service, the wedding collection, your portrait collections, how that can help them with what they said they wanted. The fourth step is to basically make your offer. That's your pitch portion. And then the fifth step is to invite them to be your client and for them to actually pay on the phone. So many photographers forget asking for payment and they'll just send an invoice later, and that might lose the sale because people get busy. But the fifth step is to, invite them officially to be your client. And then also with that, you're getting their payment information over the phone. So that's the overview of it.
Okay, cool. So let's go back, like you said, step by step through each of these. You talked about the first is an introduction and an establishment of, I was writing so fast that I can't read the last word that I wrote down. So what was that? What was that point?
A boundary. Like basically boundaries. You're establishing the boundary. Okay, so I'll go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm curious about what that means, because I don't think I've ever heard a sales conversation framed this way, but I like the idea of structure. So what does that mean to establish boundaries? So
for me personally, I'll just go ahead and read off what I typically say. I'll just say something like, hey, it's Heather. Thank you so much for reaching out to me about whatever they reached out to me. We have about 30 minutes together. So I'm establishing a time boundary. And basically I'll say I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions and just feel free to share whatever is on your mind. So I think that time boundary is really important because I got kids, I have a life. I don't want to be on the phone for 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. I want to make sure it's the most effective it can be.
But it creates a sense of urgency as well. Like you're creating limitations, so there's some urgency built into that, which is good. And
I think also too, your potential client would also appreciate, because when you're thinking about you're going into a sales conversation, your potential client, they're smart people. They know they're going to be sold to, and they don't want to sit there for hours being okay, they're going to push this on me, they're going to push that on me. And so they don't want to feel sold to. So I tell them, hey, we have 30 minutes, okay? We're not going to go longer. I'm not mean with this at all. Like if they're still talking, I'm not going to like hang up on them. Yeah. But you know, I'm establishing that boundary so they also know what to expect. And this is also in my prep emails as well. So it's just reiterating that process because, you know, honestly, not every client reads every email either. So you're just reiterating it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I'll stop there. It's so tempting to go there because that's a conversation that it's not just applicable for clients, but photographers as well. There's so much noise that we're taking in all the time, but we do have to keep that in mind because in order to, I guess, maximize, especially in the context of sales, maximize the effectiveness of the call, we have to minimize the noise, right? So I love the idea that you're not only creating limitations, boundaries for the sake of your own benefit, but it also kind of eases the mind of the client too. They know that you're not going to, or they're not going to have to listen to you drone on for an hour about what you think they should do. That's actually really cool. Okay. So then step 2 is ask insightful questions.
Yes.
And I mean, I guess to play a little bit of devil's advocate, it's commonplace for photographers to talk about quote unquote, developing a relationship with their clients. But to me, a lot of the times those efforts seem very kind of surface level. How do we actually go beyond that and ask, when you say insightful, I would consider those maybe even deep questions that kind of go below that surface level. What does that look like?
Yeah, so the first question that I really like to ask is just asking them what inspired them to reach out to me and even schedule the call in the first place. So this is more of like a market research question where I'm like, I want to know what of my marketing strategies they saw or that they heard about, or, you know, if it was a past client who shared the experience with them and that's how they heard about me. Like, I want to know how did they actually hear about me and then what inspired them to reach out. And I think that also plays into like, hey, they're the one who scheduled this with me. Like, they're the ones who reached out. So like in that case, like I have full permission to share what I'm going to be sharing. And so like, it's just honestly, it's helpful for me to know what of my marketing strategies is working. You know, and then also too, like if were referred by a past client, I also like to, you know, send my past clients who refer me out special gifts. So like, that's also helping the overall experience that I offer.
Okay, cool. So you kind of established the baseline, which is where did you come from? Like, how did you hear about me? That's the first insightful question. But then where does it go from that? When again, thinking about insightful questions.
Yeah, so basically, I guess it starts more surface level, but basically I'm just, hey, so tell me about, you know, your wedding, or tell me about your high school senior daughter who you need a portraits for, or tell me about your family. So it's just kind of like that base level question of whatever they're reaching out to you for. Just tell me more about that. It's an open-ended question. They're going to share more about their daughter or their fiance or the wedding they have planned. And then one of the things, like if I get stuck, I always like to say like, oh, so tell me more about that, because then it's just like, it helps me get my bearings and kind of think of the next question to ask. Okay. But beyond that, it's just like, okay, so why are portraits of, you know, your family so important to you right now? Why have you waited, you know, 5 years, 10 years to actually hire a professional photographer? So those kind of questions where you kind of get under it. And then also, I mean, carrying on, like, when you ask these questions, it's also making sure they have time to answer them. Another really great question that I like to answer or ask is like, you know, do you have any reservations about being photographed? I know for myself that like, I don't like being in front of the camera. In fact, this eCam is like up on my screen, but I have it shifted over so I don't see myself because I would be too distracted. And so I am not a fan of seeing myself on camera. And so I know my clients won't be, like most of them, not all of them, most of them won't be a fan of that either. And so I just like to know like, hey, what kind of reservations do you have about being photographed? You know, are there any sort of, you know, just things that I need to be aware of? And that just helps me provide a better service for them.
Okay. So you've collected this information and then you're moving on to step 3 here on my notes, the reaffirmation or even the repetition of the conversation thus far. And is that more just to confirm the understanding, the details of this potential job that they're talking about?
So there's one more distinction that I want to make with the asking question part. This is more for the photographers who offer products and do IPS. This is like a really important question to ask as well. So I'm also adamant about getting, hey, what is their end goal with the photos? I don't want them just to get the, personally, like I do products, like I offer products to my clients. A lot of my clients, you know, get gorgeous albums, wall art, the whole 9 yards. And so I want to know from the beginning what are the products that they are actually interested in. So I will even say like, hey, after like, your wedding day has passed, how do you want to remember the images from that day? Like when you walk in your, apartment after, a hard day's work, what do you want to see on the walls? What do you want to see, on the coffee table? So I'm having them describe how they want to see and experience those portraits after everything is said and done. And this will help me tie back into the products that I offer them.
Yeah, that sets you up for the sale later on.
Exactly.
Okay, that totally makes sense. And then to that reaffirmation process, you're just kind of repeating it back to them so you're sure that you heard them clearly?
Yes. Yeah. So then basically the reaffirmation is like if they shared anything that they were concerned about. Perfect example would be, high school seniors, they're in, they have hormones going on. They might break out. So like they might say like, hey, like I'm very self-conscious about my skin. I still break out. I have acne. And that gives me an opportunity to say, hey, I totally understand. That happens in this age group. That's totally normal. We actually partner with a professional hair and makeup artist, and her sole job that day is to get you looking and feeling the most beautiful you've ever been, and really just accentuate the features you love about yourself and hide the ones that you're not a fan of. So again, like basically I'm tying it back into what I offer in my experience that addresses the concern that they have.
Okay, that's really good. And it speaks for itself. So let me jump to the next point then, making the offer. And again, this is where we all kind of clinch up and get nervous and we're like, oh shoot, now I have to ask them to buy my thing. What does that look like from your perspective?
Yes. So what I have done, and this is how I teach it in my program, is actually to create some sort of a web page or a PDF, some sort of a document that you can send your potential client while you're on the phone with him. Now, this is not something that they see beforehand. We want to make sure we're guiding them through this process. So I actually have, and it can be anything. So basically I would send them a PDF, or I would send them the specific link. I would say like, hey, are you next to your computer right now? I would love to send you our collection information, and then we can walk through it together and you can ask any questions you have. So then basically I will send them that web link, that PDF, whatever. I'll go through each and every point. And when I'm going through those points, and like, let's just say I'm getting to the point about, hey, here's some sample canvases I offer, I can tie it back to like, you already mentioned that you would love to have, this portrait in this little nook in your house, of your senior son. This option might be really good for that. So I'm not saying like you have to do it. I'm just saying this might be something to consider. This might be a good option for that. If they mention they wanted an album, of course I have like little photo of an album on there so I can reference whatever they said they wanted on the collections that I offer. So that's how we kind of like tie it back to what they already said.
Yep. Yeah. And well, and I guess you've really kind of summed it up beautifully at this point, but I'm just thinking of how that would ease the conversation. I guess you even said this earlier, for the photographer who's nervous about selling something, they're able to kind of ease that discomfort by knowing the client. And they've done that now by asking a lot of detailed questions. They have context. So they're selling based on that context. It's not just this kind of general, buy my service. It's they're actually saying, hey, based on, you said this, this, and this, and I think actually this option and this option work really well because it meets the needs that you were. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And I think a lot of times, and this was definitely me in the early years, people can be so apprehensive about sales because they feel it's so pushy and like you're shoving your stuff on somebody who doesn't really want it. But if we can reframe this entire conversation like, hey, tell me what you want, and then I'm just going to show you how what I offer fits what you want.
Brilliant. And it's simple, and it's simple. Like sometimes we say something as simple as easy, but there's actually a lot involved. But like that's really straightforward. I really love that. Okay. So then we get to number 5, which is to invite them to actually pay for that service while they're on the phone. Again, photographers, probably myself included, kind of clinch up a little bit like, oh shoot, like I'm gonna have to actually ask them to pay for this thing. How do they do that with a little bit more ease of mind?
Yes. So what I'll say, and I'm only going to say this, I'm only going to share this with them if I truly think that they're a good fit. If they're not a good fit, then, we end the conversation earlier in the process. So I'm not trying to twist somebody's arm who I know instinctively is just not going to work. But if they are a good fit, I'll say something like, hey, like, I think they're the perfect bride and that you love this collection. It's exactly what you've been looking for. What do you think? So then I'll give them an opportunity to share what they think, to share what, and also it's so cool because when I ask the, hey, what do you think question, they'll go ahead and name off what they actually like about that collection or what they like about the experience, what they find most valuable. And that's actually really insightful for me to hear. So that is the kind of like the question. And then, sometimes they might have questions and we can talk about that in a moment. But if there's like, hey, I think this is great, this is exactly what I've been looking for, what I then say is like, awesome. This is so exciting. In order to make this official, there's just 2 more things to do. The first one is the agreement, which I'll go ahead and email you as soon as we get off the phone. The second one is just accepting the payment. Which credit card or which card would you like to use? So I'm not asking them if they want to pay right now. I'm just saying, which card do you want to use?
Assuming. Yeah.
Yep. I'm assuming a yes from the very start.
Interesting. Okay. So. Now, you mentioned in passing some follow-up questions that you might ask during that conversation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so sometimes they might have objections, and that's totally okay. Objections are not a bad thing. It just means they might need a little bit more clarity. Some common ones of like, oh, I need to talk to my fiance first, or I need to talk to my husband first, or it might be like, what are some other common objections? That's the one that I get most often. What are some objections you get?
Well, I think this is the thing. Like, I don't have a ton of sales experience. When clients were coming to meet with me, it was set up pretty well. And then I wasn't trying to hard sell products to them after the fact. So honestly, I'm a little bit of a rookie on this side too. In fact, we didn't even do IPS. We were using a gallery system when I was actively photographing weddings. We were using a gallery system. We'd upload the images and then the clients could buy prints or they didn't have to. I regret doing that now. I wish I had been more proactive in sales. So this is a learning curve for me too.
Yeah. So the most common objections that I get are like, hey, they need to talk to somebody else first. There have been on occasion, they had just more questions about the process or like the timing of everything. You might occasionally get like, oh, it might be too expensive or I can't afford it kind of a question as well. That might be a common one. But then, and so like you can address each one of those. For the, hey, like I need to talk to somebody else first. What I like to do is help my potential client like practice this conversation. So let's say I'm talking to a mom who wants to hire me for her daughter's senior photos, and the husband is in charge of the finance, and so she can't move forward without his approval kind of a thing. And so he's at work, so he's not around, and so she'll just say, hey, like I just need to talk to my husband first. And I say, hey, that's totally cool. Do you feel like you have enough information to share with him? And so that helps me to know, like, do I need to share anything else with her? Is she confident with it? And then I'll ask her, I'm like, okay, so how are you going to bring this up and I use their names too. It's very important to use names, but how are you going to share this with, your husband? And that gives her a time to practice the pitch. I mean, I can't be there when she's pitching my services to her husband. So I want her to practice that conversation.
Wow.
And then this is the really important part. Like if they're not ready to move forward at that particular moment, that's fine. But I would like to always book in another call. I will not leave it open-ended. So I'll say like, oh yeah. And then I'll ask, so when do you think you can talk to your husband about this? And most of the time she'll say, oh, like tonight when he gets home from work. I'll be like, great. Is it okay if we, schedule a quick follow-up call tomorrow at, 9:30? And then, she'll say yes or no, we'll find a time. And then I'll put that back into my calendar system. So she, again, gets more reminder emails. And also I send out reminder text messages as well. And then those emails have a lot of testimonials in them. And so it kind of like preps for this. And then also when you actually schedule in another call, you're not going to be left wondering and waiting what happened, which I think is just so important. I've heard from so many photographers, like they just hate, like they felt ghosted and like they never hear back from a client. And so even if it's a no, like I want to know it's a no. So most of the time, like it's not a no. Like, I mean, I have a pretty solid pre-qualification process, so I'm not dealing with a lot of no's. But even if it were, like I'd want to know, like instead of just being like, okay, well, they just disappeared. Like I have no idea what happened. And then you start to question, maybe it was my pricing. Maybe I need to, knock my prices down a little bit and discount because maybe I'm just not worth it.
So you're actually scheduling that call. If the decision isn't made while you're on that 30-minute call, then you're scheduling a second one so you can at least have the conversation and there are no questions left.
Correct.
I like that.
That is correct.
Yeah, that's super proactive. Okay, well, you know what? First of all, I have to give you major props, Heather, because like this has been extremely practical, extremely actionable, and to my earlier point, not even that complicated either. It's just,
No.
it's simple ideas that we can go apply right now. So
Yes.
I really can't thank you enough. I know that there's a lot more to sales though than just this, 45-minute conversation that we've had here. So will you share just a little bit more? And you didn't even ask me to do this, but I'd love for you to share, just because you're such a good teacher, a little bit more with our listeners about the additional education that you offer.
Sure. Before we get into that, can I actually share one more bonus tip?
Yeah, please.
That has made all the difference in my conversation. So I don't necessarily do this with a whole lot of my portrait clients because they're, paying a lower session fee, and then this bigger sales is later on with the products. But definitely for my wedding, and I also photograph brand clients, the higher collection pricing. One of the things that I have done that has been so instrumental is offering a booking day bonus. And this is so important because when I'm actually going through my collection with, let's just say, a bride, and I'm getting to the very end, I can say something like, oh, and you actually have the ability to, if you want to move forward today, you actually get this booking bonus, and it's a really sweet deal. It's changed over time, and it's all based on like your client. So I'm just going to give you what worked really well for me, and this might work for your listeners or it might not, but the idea is to offer some sort of incentive for them to move forward quickly. But for my bride specifically, I found that like the brides that I was connected to that were being like, we just jived really well together. They were like best friends with their mom. Like they would be doing everything with their mom. Their mom was very active in their wedding planning process. And so my booking bonus was basically offering a parent album completely complimentary. I was willing to take on that cost because during the conversation, I was actually having these calls with the bride and her mom. It wasn't the fiance, it was the bride and the mom. So when we went through the process and I was like, hey, the booking bonus, I was like, hey, mom, that's actually for you because I know you're spending a lot of time, energy, and effort into planning your daughter's wedding. And, she might be your only, like, I would know by then if it was just like the only daughter. And so this booking bonus is actually for you because I want you to actually have an album that you can remember and look back on and cherish that day. And so that was such a game changer because mom was the one that held the card. And so like when I actually had a gift, yes, when I actually had a gift for her, that's when I was having brides pay in full after a 30-minute conversation, and it was incredible. And of course, that's not the only booking bonus you can do, but just the idea of having a limited time bonus, not to pressure them into anything, but just to help them move forward quicker. And like, if it's a good fit, they're going to get an added bonus. And ideally, the bonus is really going to serve them at, a higher level.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great tip, actually. So I hope everybody, if you weren't taking notes, go back, listen to the episode again, take some notes, because again, very actionable, practical information. Heather, do share just a little bit about the additional education that you offer through your site as well.
Yes. So, I mean, all the information is basically at thebokedphotographer.com. So yeah, thank you for putting it up on the screen. We have a lot of free resources there. So you can basically, click on whatever resource that best suits you. We have a free class, a free crash course. We have a blog that is full of information and just like, if you prefer reading, reading all of those tips. So basically that is how you would get a hold of me. We actually have also a 12-month mentorship program if people want to go a little bit deeper. That's also on the website as well. So everything's there.
Well, perfect. I've put it all up here on the screen. So everybody make sure that you go check out thebokedphotographer.com and then go follow Heather over at Heather Chesky on Instagram, Heather, and then Chesky on Instagram. Of course, we'll link to this in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. But Heather, thank you so much, truly, for making time for all of us, myself included today. It was really encouraging and exciting information. And everybody, enjoy your weekend. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for